Let us start with the history of the sex education. We need to know that sex education is a concept that's been around for many, many years. And it did not just start in Ontario in 2015. As a matter of fact, there are other provinces and other countries that have been implementing this education since the 80s. And the start of this idea, it's even older than that. I'm going to use today a book called Too Hot to Handle. This book is written by Dr. Jonathan Zimmerman, who's a professor of history of education in the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Zimmerman approached me in 2015. I believe he saw my name in one of the articles as a participant of the opposition to the sex education. He contacted me and interviewed me over the phone, where he wrote an article on the activities happening in Toronto against sex education. We had an excellent conversation and had great inputs. I learned a lot from him. And then he sent me his book as a gift. He talks about the history of sex education. There are very interesting points that I really need to share with you today so we can put things in perspective. Sex education did not just start in Ontario in 2015. I have certain points that I wrote down from the book that will give us an excellent foundation for us to start our presentation. In the book, he talks about a school teacher in Sweden called Ellen Key, a very important name in the world of sex education. We will know now why in a second. In 1900, the Swedish schoolteacher Ellen Key, in her book, The Century of the Child, she advocated or presented certain ideas in 1900. Children learned best on their own and with their own parents, who had surrendered too much influence and authority to school. So even back then, schools had too much influence and authority on children and shaping up children's personality. She was a big advocate of parents regaining their authority, especially on the issues of individuality. That's what she called it. That includes conscious judgment and free will. And the best place to develop conscious judgment and free will, she believes, would be at home. He also mentioned that state-run schools have exploded in the West between 1950 and 1970, and the percentage of children who attended primary schools rose from 58% and 83%. So although the school teacher, Ellen Key, she was pushing or advocating for educating children at home, the opposite happened. The state-run schools have exploded between 1950 and 1970 to take on even more students. From 58% to 83% of students in certain countries were actually attending state-run schools as opposed to learning at home. In the developed world, children-centered classrooms were distributed by social class. The way the children learned in the developed world back then, it was based on social class. So wealthier children received personalized attention and instruction. So it was more of a one-to-one education where they bring in the teacher or the specialist to teach the child a certain skill or a certain science. On the other hand, poorer children in a classroom were subjected to or taught by the way of close adherence and emulation of others' actions. They were basically subjected to indoctrinations, more of a robotic programming approach. That was the style of teaching the poor children. Another important point mentioned in the book was that the same century that Ellen Key wrote her book, The Century of the Child, she wanted to focus on the development of the child, it was also the century of sex. The 20th century was known to be the century of sex. Key forecasted that people have commenced already to experience with unions outside of marriage. So in that century, people are really actively experimenting relationships outside of marriage. And she said in her book that the whole problem is being made the subject of debate. People were debating that idea. Can we have relationships outside of marriage? People were rebelling against the traditional values and the traditional way of life. It's important for us to know, as mentioned by the author, that Key was an avowed enemy of Christianity. That's what he called her. She was an affirmed and strong enemy of Christianity, or religion in particular. She was an enemy, as he said, to religions that vilified the idea of bodily pleasures. So she's advocating for a personalized education, but that lady was also an enemy of religion and the idea of controlling or regulating the concept of bodily pleasures. Dr. Zimmerman also mentioned that Key was looking forward to the day when more and more individuals could determine their own sexual destinies. So that lady was a big promoter of self-control of sexual destinies. At that time also, a new model of companionate marriage was introduced that promises sexual pleasure for men and women alike. Very important statement to pay attention to, separating lovemaking from reproduction. So the same time of Key's work, it was the heavy promotion of reintroducing marriage and relationships, I should say. So they were heavily promoting the separation of lovemaking for pure pleasure and marriage or relationships that aim for reproduction. There was also the rise of the concept of liberalization of sexual mores, sexual values, and sexual autonomy. Now we're talking about more and more sexual freedom. Commenting on the sexual freedom and the sexual autonomy, the author posed a very interesting question. He asked, but where would they learn, children, where would they learn to exercise that freedom? And then he says, the modern answer is sex education. So as we see here, sex education, based on history and based on what experts say, has a very clear goal to teach children how to exercise their sexual freedom, how to determine their sexual destinies, how to take full control of their sexual life under the banner of sexual autonomy. The century of school met the century of sex, as the author described. The marriage between school and sex proved to be stormy and delicate. It's known to be a very sensitive topic, and it's always created problems. He also said there are few concerns that were raised back then. A concern of child sexuality. To talking about child sexuality, there's a concern of corrupting innocent minds. It's always been a concern since the beginning or the early introduction of such ideas. Also, children could learn about human reproduction without prematurely, and listen to this, it's a very important statement. Critics said, even back then, that children could learn about human reproduction without prematurely igniting their interest in practicing the sexual act. So there was always a fear and a concern of igniting children's interest in practicing sexual acts if we introduce those sexual ideas in an early stage. Critics condemned sex education also for a very important concept that we'll be talking about later, which is fostering the same promiscuity it claimed to control. So since then, critics were concerned that sex education and sexual freedom will definitely foster promiscuity, unregulated multiple relationships without any control and without any guidance. This is the history of sex education, and this proves to us that the goal is very clear, is to give students freedom, to give students full control of their sexual destinies. And the same concerns that we have nowadays are the same concerns that were raised by critics tens of years ago. What are these concerns? Corrupting innocent minds, igniting interest in practicing sexual acts, and promoting promiscuity and multiple unregulated relationships. We did not just make that up. We did not just saying it out of ignorance and just sheer attack and opposition. This is real. It's been going on for many years, and this is what we're building our opposition on.